Did you know the Vikings in Iceland were the first to create a parliament and advocate for a modern sense of democracy? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about Vikings with historian Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll discuss the misunderstood Vikings with cultural scholar Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez. But first, a trivia question. What days of the week were named after gods worshipped by the Vikings? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez on the show today. Lillian is an historian, published author. She specializes in medievalism, the Vikings, popular culture, and cultural identity. She is an educator and has taught the Golden Age of Spain at the University of Winchester, as well as working on various research projects. She is also the host of several podcasts and the CEO at Travelusions Tours, a tour guiding company that specializes in affordable and accessible mindful tourism. When I learned about Lillian's passion for history, culture, and travel, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Lillian will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Lillian. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
So what's the most unique thing about you?
Oh my God, that's such a loaded question. The most unique thing about me. I'm a pretty weird individual, so I could come up with all sorts of things. But I am probably the only scholar in my field, mostly because my field doesn't exist. And I made it. I think that's pretty unique. So yeah, I think that's definitely amongst the many things that make me a strange, bizarre, and unique person. That's the winner for sure.
So what sparked your interest in Vikings?
Ooh, that's a conversation that, oh my God, could probably take up the whole time, but I'll try and sort of streamline it for you. So originally, I come from Spain, from the north of Spain to be specific, and the way history is taught in schools in Spain is very sort of X, Y, Z. You constantly, throughout your entire life as a child, you literally study the same topics over and over, and there is not a lot of opportunity to study history that is not Spanish history. And Spanish history isn't actually very nice for the vast majority of it. You know, there are many wars, particularly a lot of civil wars, in more recent years, the dictatorship. So I kind of grew up for a really long time thinking, oh my God, the history of my country sucks. It's so nasty in the sense of, so sad. Why would anyone want to study that? And at the same sort of time, I started being interested by early medieval studies through other means. My dad is very much into history, and we used to have conversations about random things. And there is a part of history where the Vikings actually arrived to Spain. There is a very famous attack on Seville, which is actually taken through by one of the most famous Vikings from the sagas, Bjorn Ironside. Anyone who has watched the series Vikings knows Bjorn, so I'm sure the name is familiar. And I thought, those people are so intriguing. And they were so different, right, from everything that I knew about Spanish history. We were talking about people who had a hard life and decided, you know what, I'm not going to have enough with what the world is giving me, and I'm going to go and find a better life somewhere else. And that kind of really drew me on. I've always been a big fan on things like Tolkien and fantasy. And obviously, a lot of that comes down from Viking mythology. So there was a very easy link in there. But what really captivated me was when I actually realized that the Vikings were the first proper Europeans to discover the New World. Big win, particularly from a Spanish perspective, right? Always thinking about Columbus getting there first. And more importantly, and the subject that I've really devoted the vast majority of my academic life to, the fact that Viking women had actually a huge role to play in society, and they had so many rights in comparison to the women in other early medieval societies. And it sort of became a rabbit hole because I just started reading and reading and reading. And I was like, yeah, I would have quite happily been part of this group. What a shame. It was, hundreds of years ago. And that's how my fascination for the Vikings sort of became my job.
Let's go into, since you mentioned the women, can you tell us more about the importance and power that women held in the Viking Age?
Yes, I mean, again, that's a huge topic, and it kind of varies a little bit from the different parts of the Viking world. People usually think that the Viking world is just Scandinavia, sort of like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, but actually, the Vikings were in the UK for a very long time and taking over the vast majority of the country. They were in Ireland as well, and they created trade networks that went all the way to the Black Sea, creating, in fact, the Kingdom of Kiev, which I think is particularly relevant in this day and age, considering how things are. So there was actually a lot of opportunities for these women to grow power. The most traditional way in which women had power was actually very simple and something that we tend to overlook. In Viking society, men were sort of seen as disposable, quote unquote, because, they could go raiding, you would create more children, they could be replaced. But women were seen as the real owners of the household. They actually had the keys to the house, to the farmstead, to everything. So they were really considered as something precious because they were givers of life, right? And many other sort of Germanic people thought this way as well. But the Vikings in particular took this very seriously. So that was a way in which women were already more powerful. The vast majority of the household decisions were run by women. They would decide, they would, tell the men what to do, what to say. And we see this very clearly in the sagas, right? We have particularly lots of women characters in the sagas that are put down as the archetype of goaders or inciters, which essentially sort of just stir the pot. And that's their entire life. So even if they were not able to directly exercise their power in some cases, they would be the ones sitting there telling someone, I really think you should kill that guy. So how about you go and do it? Otherwise, I'm going to make your life miserable here and you will have no choice but to kill that guy. And the fact that this was assumed as an okay thing and they were able to do these things, just I think is fascinating. But on top of that, Viking women had access to vote, particularly if they were widows or if they were the only members of the family remaining, which we don't see the parallel of that elsewhere in Europe. I mean, the Vikings were the first people to create an actual parliament as we know it in this day and age. So of course, their political importance would have been huge. And Viking women could also rule on their own right. And we see this across different characters in Europe, but there is one particularly from Kiev that I'm very, very fond of, and that is Olga of Kiev, the famous Saint Olga, who after her husband gets killed in some pretty gruesome manners, takes over the kingdom and actually makes it prosperous and manage to lead the conversion of her entire kingdom. That actually is what allows the Kievan Rus to succeed. So when you have figures like that, it really reflects that their positions were elevated. And sure, women in other places in Europe were able to rule, but they never seemed to have as much freedom, as much open areas where they could interfere. Now, I don't know, and we don't know really whether that is because the sources from other European countries were maybe more constrained by religious norms or by their own political standards, or whether the sources from the Vikings have been more romanticized by their own writers. So, there is a bias there that we need to consider, but it shows in many ways that these women were able to do other things that their European counterparts couldn't. It's particularly showing as well in trade. We know that a lot of women, particularly in the big Viking hubs such as Birka, would have actually owned their own business. They would have done their own accounts. They would have been in charge of actually directing the money, collecting goods, that sort of stuff. Sure, we have examples elsewhere in Europe, but they are not as prominent. And the sheer numbers in that sense, if we just look purely at the numbers game, it shows that something was happening in Scandinavia that allowed these women to have some more freedom. And whether you're looking at it from like a top-down view of the rulers to the subjects, or the opposite, the ordinary women to their queens and rulers, it is obvious that it wasn't just a social status, it was a societal convention.
Going back to what you said about being romanticized. On your website, you stated that the Vikings are one of the most romanticized and misunderstood civilizations in Europe. Tell us more about where you came up with that speculation.
It's not even speculation. It's very, very obvious when you actually know the sources and when you see the fact. It comes from many different perspectives, but I'll point at some key moments in history when this happened. So first of all, even in the Middle Ages, because the Vikings were seen as an outsiders, not necessarily because they didn't belong to, say, France, England, places like that, but because they were outsiders from a religious perspective, right? The people who were writing about them mostly were monks, educated men with a Christian religious background. They were already given an image that it puts them in a worse light than they actually were, because a lot of the things the Vikings were doing, the rest of their European contemporaries were doing as well. We just painted as, oh, it was a holy war, so it's okay. Things like that. There was always some form of a religious excuse that made the behaviors of their contemporaries seem okay, or because they were seen as Christian rulers or Christian people, they were perceived as being more civilized, and therefore it doesn't matter if they were raiding or if they were pillaging or doing all of these things. So it already starts there in the Middle Ages with that idea of the outsider stranger that comes to take my gold and my women and all of these things. That already creates a layer of romanticism and idealism that is not exactly the truth. Then, as we move forward into the early modern periods of history, particularly with the discovery of the New World, a lot of people start seeing them as sort of freedom seekers, right? What kind of person could allow themselves to just get a boat and go across the Atlantic with what could be perceived to a modern eye very minimal supplies and attempt to find somewhere like Finland or Greenland or any of these places? It was such a romantic view of exploring and sort of discovering unknown places that really attracted a lot of people. So of course there was already a liking for the Vikings in that sense, not so much from the point of view of barbarians, raiders, whatever, but from the point of view of these people went, explored, discover, how amazing. And those two images sort of collect together into one, which is, I think, the general idea that we have of the Vikings during the 19th century because of the movement of Romanticism in the humanities and in art particularly, and literature. And Wagner actually does a lot to bring that idea together, because Wagner was such a successful composer. He drew a lot of his inspiration from classical literature and from medieval literature, and of course for his people, from the point of view Germanic person, Viking mythology is directly linked with Germanic mythologies. Almost, I'm not going to say the same because that's not true, but it's pretty much the same thing. And he brings all of that into a stage for the world to see, with these beautiful costumes, with this beautiful music, and all of those ideas, all of those romantic paintings, all of those things sort of collide into one. And therefore we have this beautiful idea of the Vikings with horns and swords, pillaging everywhere, but also being very heroic and very poetic and valorous. So it's a very sort of contradicting idea that all alludes to the same thing. Every time humans look back to the Middle Ages, they're looking for escapism. It's something that we've noticed throughout time. They were perceived as dark ages, or a moment in time when things were not as clear because of the decline of the Roman Empire, and therefore they are seen as a period of opportunities, maybe lost opportunities, maybe gainful opportunities, but opportunities. And we immediately associate them with that escapism. We also tend to think of the Middle Ages overall, not just the Vikings, as a harder period for mankind because of that direct contrast between the Roman Empire and then the Age of Discovery. So it's kind of like our renovated version of the caveman, if you like. That's essentially what we've made the Middle Ages. But on top of that, the Vikings had all of these extra items that made them really cool. And a few archaeological discoveries that take place during the 19th century, particularly in Denmark, Germany, Norway, such as ships, such as helmets, swords. They were artifacts that no one had found before. They were in such a state of conservation that, they were an archaeologist's dream. And these really perks people's curiosity. And all it takes is someone having seen a play, read a book, and find a helmet to suddenly put this, majestic display of, oh my God, these things were awesome. Unfortunately, this awesomeness attracts a lot of attention from many different perspectives. And these ideas of Vikings as heroic or romantic, whatever you want to call them, start being used for political gain. It happens a lot, for example, in England and in some of the Scandinavian countries during the 19th century, but it really peaks in the early 20th 20th century. And unfortunately, the Nazis used a lot of Viking imagery to call their Scandinavian so-and-so brothers to arms, sort of suggesting that their ancestors were so heroic and powerful that this was the way they would free themselves and help the Third Reich. So because of this, the image has been distorted and transformed so much that it is just created a huge mess, really, for modern historians to understand. On top of that, people like Tolkien using the mythology and whatnot to feed their own stories. When we transform it into general fantasy, people turn to see things from a very, simplistic way. So what used to be people with developed societies, parliament, rights, women who could do all of these things suddenly just become marauders on a ship. And for a really long time in archaeology and in history, that's literally all the treatment that the Vikings are given, let alone the women. So it wasn't really until the 90s where we started doing that sort of makeover, I guess you could call it, about them and about the fact that they were just people like everyone else, and they had all of these developments that should actually be praised rather than just, cross them off as pillagers, barbarians, pirates, whatever. And that's what I think really has created a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions, because on the one hand, we still want them to be these freedom seekers because that's very appealing. But on the other hand, they deserve to actually be seen for all of the amazing things that they also did. And that causes problems. But, well.
Why do you think that we have become so interested in Vikings again today?
I mean, I genuinely think it is really a bit to do with the state of the world. That political atmosphere of the early 20th century in some ways mirrors very clearly what we're going through right now. I'm not saying everywhere, but certainly in some places in the world. And capitalism overall and the general way that human life is going with all of these pressures, the rat race that particularly young people have to go through to be somewhere. Thinking of this brutal past where you could just grab a sword and a boat and make a name for yourself. Again, it is so freeing. It's kind of giving you a way out. And on top of that, the way technology has developed has allowed for romantic stories like this to reach a much wider audience through TV and film. So of course, a lot of people who may have not known about the Vikings 30 years ago now do. And that kind of just creates a general retrofit that takes us back to the original point of departure of that romanticism, that escapism and whatnot. Because the thing about humans is we're complicated creatures, and at the same time we're not. And our psychology normally dictates that we are attracted to the sense of doom, of fatalism, because it is an innate part of life, right? We all know we're going to die. So we can't help but see things a bit bleak every now and then. So if you can use that sense of feeling and doom and use it to transport you somewhere else for a moment, in which, sure, life was going to be brutal and horrible, but you may have been something else, then it allows you to suspend belief, and it leaves you in that realm of possibility where anything can happen. And that's very appealing for human imagination and for human nature. It's how stories are created, and that's how we survive. It's a coping mechanism, if you like.
Yeah, and I love the idea of each of us embracing a more epic story, because we tend to live lives of just very mundane, repetitive type of behaviors on a daily basis. So thinking about those epic stories, as you said, is a form of escapism, but it's also exciting to think, could I have an adventure like that?
Exactly. And I think, particularly because when you read Viking saga or just any type of text, unless it speaks about the gods, the vast majority of the people that you're reading about, they're just ordinary women and men. They are not necessarily kings and queens. And sure, we have some very famous kings and queens, but the vast majority of these people were self-made. So to the ordinary person, that is such a degree of relatability that most other medieval sources, you just don't get that, because otherwise you're reading about clergymen and people with money and power, which are not the vast majority of the population. So it increases that idea of, oh my God, maybe if I tried, maybe the right opportunity comes across, that could be me. And it's powerful. and it's addictive.
You host several podcasts yourself. Tell us about them.
I'm actually on a break from a couple of them, and the third one is coming to an end next week. But yes, it's a few of them. So the first one, and the one that has been running for the longest, is Mana Burn, which is associated with a blog that I run as well. And that is part of an attempt to explore a secondary field in which I am specializing in, which is geek culture. Because from my perspective, geek culture has a lot to do with the Vikings. I mean, video games, RPGs, comic books, science fiction, and fantasy novels. It's all the same. And in geek culture, we have some very clear realizations of these epic feelings that people, take to the next level, like with cosplay and whatnot, or even things like historical reenactment, which kind of fall in a gray line between actual history and, hobby, mundane, popular culture stuff. I've always been fascinated with subcultures in general because I think they really show the tendencies in society that we overlook. And I am a geek myself, so it's kind of helping me to put forward some of my insider knowledge with the help of the outsider knowledge that I have as an academic. And it's been a wonderful trip because it's allowed me to connect with a lot of scholars across the globe, to the point that I've actually made friends that have come with me to conferences where we've actually presented groundbreaking research on comic book studies or superheroes or things like that. So that's kind of where it started. It started with me just wanting to talk about things that I thought were relevant for society now and tied with my studies, but it developed into, oh my God, there is a whole network of people like me out there. Let's bring them together. Let's talk about this. And let's do it from the point of view of people who are also researching the subject. Because in the geek community, again, I think, and I'm not blaming them in any way, shape, or form, but there's lots of streamers and podcasters and whatnot that they have their passion and they put it out there in the world. But it's not always a whole picture of what is actually happening in society. So I always thought it was important to give that, sort of B-side of the story, if you like. And from the point of view of being a woman, and everything that I study has to do with feminism, I just thought that it was vital for someone like me to have their voice out there. Because again, when we study subcultures, particularly certain ones like geek cultures, we see really how the development of the treatment of minorities happens overall in society. And women still have a lot of ground to cover in subcultures such as geek or in certain music underground movements and whatnot. So it was another way of pulling those stories that I'm so fond of feminism in a context that perhaps some people are more reluctant to hear about. So that's how Mana Burn started. Then we have New History, which has a very limited series of podcasts because that was a blog enterprise that I started in 2010. So it's been going on for a really long time. It originally started as a platform to let university students talk about what they actually wanted to talk about rather than just university assignment. And it sort of developed into something else, which was just general young academics, maybe academics who had a difficult path to actually put their ideas out there, put their research out there. And it became a very collaborative effort that then sort of started moving on to me coming to the end of my thesis, me taking more ownership and actually steering it into a particular direction, which is the idea of new history, new with an NU, borrowing from the new metal movement, because it kind of embraces that spirit from the late 90s, early 2000s of we're gonna revamp something that is already there and is popular, but give it our own twist, a little bit, punk edge to it without being too progressive or whatever you want to call it. So it was really a way of, putting forward that the historical record isn't perfect. And even though you may hear academics and historians particularly talk about something 24/7, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% correct or that it cannot change tomorrow, or that what a lot of historians and academics are talking about is actually the most important thing or the only thing. Many of the people involved in New History were actually quite tired of hearing stuff about Tudor history. In the UK, you almost cannot hear about anything else. And it's almost the same people. It's all about Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, that sort of stuff. No one seems to care about the other people around the Tudor time. So it's like, well, why not go beyond? Why not explore? Why not take things a step further? And that's very much what that project is about. Now, the podcast that is about to come to an end comes from an entirely professional viewpoint that developed really from Travolution Tours, which is the company that I run, making travel accessible to people all over the world. And it's a podcast series that really tries to showcase the world what the job of a tour guide is, because often I think is very misconstrued. And with the pandemic, tour guides have suffered a lot, like the whole tourism industry. So it was a great opportunity to build bridges between people who had been isolated for a really long time, but also give them a platform to talk about, the beauty of their job, but also the hard things, and help those tourists sort of change their mentality, and so they can be better prepared when they go somewhere, to actually be more mindful of their tour guides, to choose to have a tour guide because it can enhance their experience, or even just be aware that this is something you can do when you go on holiday. And it doesn't need to be something that you just do because you have a lot of money. There are different ways in we can access tour guiding, and that's is a great experience to have. So that's coming to an end next week, and it's been a great ride both in Spanish and in English, with tour guides from Spain, Morocco, Slovenia, Russia, Italy. Oh my God, I'm sure I'm forgetting other places. That it's generally been everywhere, and it's been great because it's built this little community of people who didn't know each other beforehand, and now they do. But we've also have great feedback from the public who were enlightened by what a tour guide does, and other tour guides who didn't realize there was actually a way they could make friends. So that's what that entire series has been about, and I'm very proud of it because it's had a huge impact in the community, and that's something I'm very driven about. I like making sure that there is a space, no matter what circle you belong to, where you can be you and you can be safe, and that's definitely been achieved.
So what made you decide to create your own tour travel company?
Well, that's been a work in progress for many years. So when I was actually studying at the university, I started volunteering as a tour guide in Winchester Cathedral. And I sort of liked it. I was like, this is a way of actually talking about something I'm super passionate about, but to people who normally don't get to hear these stories. There is a lot of value in that. And then as my studies progressed, and obviously I became more of a public historian in that sense of trying to make history for everyone, I genuinely thought to myself, academia is dead. No offense, but it's the fact, academia is a really hard life. Unless you get a very sweet deal, it's tough in most countries. But this is a place where I can make an impact, not for big academic corporates with money, but for the little guy who's simply just trying to understand its own heritage. That's useful, that's cool. Like I said, that's a way of building that community, right? Empowering that community. So I started thinking about it a few years back, actually, all the way in 2016, 17, when I had another job, this time an actual paid job, as a proper tour guide in another site. And I had been doing a few things around it, and everyone just kept on telling me, you're so great. Why don't you do this yourself? Moreover, you are also historians. It's like the best of both worlds. You can, you're not just giving us anecdotes, you're actually giving us facts. And I started preparing the idea for when I was about to finish my PhD. But then the pandemic happened. So everything was put on hold for obvious reasons. And it was actually on the second lockdown here in the UK, a year ago now. Oh, wow. Yeah, a year ago, that I kind of bit the bullet and I said, you know what? It's now or never. I have the time. I have the resources. The PhD is over, and technology is actually changed and allow for people who are normally excluded from traveling to take part. This is what I live for. I need to get into here and do something about it. And so it started that way. It was kind of like taking a chance and appreciating that an opportunity was happening, and also really just realizing that when I was with people, whether it was face-to-face or virtually, talking to them, seeing them learn something new, seeing them be so excited about new places, that made me feel amazing. I was like being on top of the world. And who doesn't want to do that? Whatever is it that brings you that kind of joy? Why would you say no to it if at least you have the chance of doing it? So I thought, I gotta try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, then at least I know I tried and I can learn from that experience or move on. And that's how we've ended up today with 3 tours back to back and not really knowing what I am anymore. But yeah.
That's amazing. And it's wonderful that you're so passionate about it. So how did you end up relocating to the UK?
Well, it all really comes to do with my studies, but also with life in Spain and my family history, which is all kind of jumbled up. So I'll try to put a coherent line to it. So my parents were actually living in the UK when I was a very, very young child. When I was 6, I was not with them in the UK. They were living in London. I was in Spain with my grandparents. And the overarching idea had always been that we will all move to the UK. My dad is a huge fan of the UK. My mom was in love with London. They really saw it as a place of opportunities. And in the late 90s, where I come from in the north of Spain, job opportunities were sparse, very sparse. So this was the plan. But as things happen, life gets in the way. There were some troubles back home. So my parents came back. And kind of from that moment, there was always the thing of, we will go back and we will take Lily with us, and Lily will love it. And oh boy, did I, because they took me on my first holiday to the UK when I was 9. I was absolutely just dazzled by it. And I had been studying English since I was 4. I loved the culture. I was fascinated by all of these museums and things and stuff. And it just made sense. This is what the family plan is. So let's carry it out. On top of that, as I moved through the education levels in Spain, like I said, education in Spain is very sort of one road. You don't really have many other options. And what I really wanted to do with my life, there wasn't a huge provision for it in Spain because, well, it was still very much a backward educational system. And my dad, who had been looking into it for a very long time, had shown me all of these amazing programs and strange degrees that I didn't even know existed in the UK. And I was like, you can learn to be a writer? What? But more importantly, the history programs in the vast majority of the UK were about things that had nothing to do with Spain, which was perfect. So I really worked hard to improve my grades so that I could come up to the same level of English student, which required quite a lot of effort. And eventually sent my application like anyone else would. I was invited for open days. I came, I saw different universities. I loved it. And we made the decision that it was gonna, take a lot of effort and I was gonna do it on my own to begin with. And for an 18-year-old, it's quite a big decision to make. But I've always been quite adventurous and I genuinely saw an opportunity, not just for myself, but for my community, for my family to grow that way. So I took it. And that's how 13 years later, I'm still here somehow. And admittedly, the UK has changed a lot. And perhaps if things would have been different, I wouldn't have been here for that long. But I've made the most of all of the opportunities that have come my way. And I'm really glad that I did because if nothing else, it taught me how to be a better person. I had to rely entirely on myself. And as much as that also means that I am neither properly Spanish nor properly English, I have found value on both cultures. And it's really allowed me to form my own identity, which, it's a huge part of growing up. So it's been a strange experience, but very, very good in many different ways.
Do you see yourself staying in the UK?
That's so no, not really. It's a shame, and it's mostly because, unfortunately, when we do these things, we don't see what's coming in the future, right? And I don't think anyone saw Brexit coming, and it is a sore point. Now, when the votes for Brexit and all of that started happening, I was literally finishing my master's, and I used to live in a very quaint town in the south of England called Winchester. Like I said, it was a very quiet community, very appealing, very safe. I never felt insecure there ever in my life, despite living all on my own. And then something changed. People changed. And then I started seeing things and hearing things that made me not just uncomfortable for myself, but for a lot of people around me. And things changed in the UK very quickly. And to begin with, I thought it was just me being paranoid, maybe overanalyzing from a historical perspective, something like that. But then people around me, both foreigners and locals alike, started echoing my concerns. And I only have to point at the TV to our current leadership to give you an example of what life is like in the UK right now. And it is sad. It is sad because it's not the country that I fell in love with. There are some aspects of it, of course, and I guess maybe there was always an element of the grass is greener. But even from a simple point of view of livelihood, opportunities, the state of young people in this country, access to things like just property, like for someone like me to buy a house is almost an impossible thought in the UK. And obviously, it reaches a point in everyone's life where you know what you want to do with your life. And I know what I want to do or what I think is best for me. So I made the decision that I had to go. But then the pandemic happened. So now that things are normalizing, I am working on my escape route, if you like. But then I realized that my job at Travolution has the perfect opportunity to allow for that freedom of movement and to satisfy both my social needs and my personal needs. So it's kind of all a big synergy of of my work, if that makes sense.
What's ahead for you? What projects are you most excited about?
I'm one of those people that always has so many fingers and so many pies, and I struggle to say no sometimes towards my detriment, but I like being busy. And there's a few. There is a publication that I'm really waiting for that is very special to me because it talks about the inheritance of Spain and its Muslim and Jewish culture through food. And I am a big foodie, and I actually realized halfway through my career that you can be a food historian. And it ties in perfectly with identity, culture, gender, all of these things that are already my jam. So I very much started exploring that aspect towards the end of my PhD. I went to a few cultural conferences, and it seems that, people in Spain value food very much, but they are not all very aware of how that food has reached their table or why it's important. And I saw a perfect opportunity to bring that to light to a community such as the Spanish community that I think really needs it right now to get over their past, sort of like appreciate what we've gone through and how we've come on the other end, and we're fine. So I'm really exploring a few options there, and I have a paper coming through soon, I think it's in spring or summer, about that cultural inheritance, which for anyone who's interested in food history, if you like food, is great, but also you will live perpetually hungry. Like it's constant. So that's definitely a project I'm very much looking forward. I am working to put my thesis on an actual book format, which obviously takes some time, but that's still there. I have my podcasts on the side, and obviously there is a lot of effort going currently into my business and my job as a public historian and a tour guide. But even there, I have projects with organizations that I think are just wonderful and deserve a lot of respect. Just one of the tours that I did today, for example, is a partnership with an American charity called Safe Ancient Studies Alliance. And what SASA, that's the acronym, are trying to do is really put to the forefront, not just to young people, but anyone who's willing to listen, the fact that we are losing our heritage. We are losing our history, and there is so much more we could be doing, but we don't talk about it enough, and therefore the generations to come are going to be worse off because of it. So I am doing work with them to showcase some of these sites that maybe are neglected and are important and deserve that attention. I'm talking about the realities of being an academic, how some people think just because you have a PhD, your life is sorted. And it's not always that way, right? It takes some work behind it and things like that. So anything that has to do with a community project that goes really to the education of people, it has a special place in my heart. And something that I'm working through on Travolution really is it's this project of transforming people to the idea of mindful tourism, which is really our route towards sustainability. It's the only way this industry is gonna continue for the foreseeable future. And mindful tourism again comes back to something that I'm just very passionate about, which is the local communities. If when you go somewhere you don't spend time in that community consciously, you are missing out. You are just a mindless consumer who is literally taking 3 photos here, 4 photos there, eating at McDonald's and going back to your home. And that helps nobody. Doesn't help you, doesn't help the place you've gone to, doesn't help your home either, because it's money you haven't spent in your local community. So by advocating for sustainable travel and mindful tourism, I really hope that people can see, how we as a society have the power. This is not down to politicians or anything like that. This is something that is within our grasp and that we can change now. So I'm working on different projects to advocate for that and really to open the world from a more accessible point of view for anybody, anywhere in the world who is excluded from that traveling community. Because, COVID really sort of opened up the eyes of, oh my God, suddenly we cannot go to places. What are we going to do? But the sad reality, and some of us already knew that, but it really came through. The sad reality is that there's a lot of people in the world who, regardless of COVID, may not be able to travel every year or every other day, whether it's for political reasons, for sociological reasons, for economic reasons. It's actually not that simple. And even without looking any further than people with accessibility needs, like just having a look at sites, like I'm talking about museums and monuments in the surrounding area in the UK, 80% of them have the worst wheelchair access in the universe. And that's just people with a wheelchair. And if we are talking about a wheelchair, then we're talking as well of, prams, babies, people with families. You are immediately completely excluding all of those people from actually helping their own stories. And that's wrong. As simple as that. That's wrong. It's something I am very, very firm about. Inclusivity and accepting people for what they are and who they are is super important to me. And again, this is another passion project for me. So that's the reason why I'm working with several platforms to really promote virtual tourism, not as a sort of solution for everything, but as an alternative that actually works for some people and things like that. And finally, Travolution was very much conceived from the point of view that if I was going to do something, it had to help other people along the way. It wasn't just good enough that it served me or that it helped these projects. So it's I guess in the United States is considered like a B Corp, a company with either an ecological and social consciousness. And we do fundraisers and awareness campaigns for different causes that very much need to be highlighted. So all of those things at once, I wouldn't be able to pick one from the other, to be honest. They reflect different aspects of my personality that I value far too much. But all of those things are what is forward for me. And it's funny because a lot of people sort of tell me, oh, now that you are a proper academic, you should be, looking to do this, do that, secure a high paying position in a university, whatever. And I'm like, no, I'm not a dinosaur in a tweed vest. Sorry, that's not me. And I know that sounds really, really harsh. That's 80% of academics in the UK right now. And that's not me. It's never been me. And I could never buy into that system where someone needs to pay £9,000 a year to receive an education for which they are barely being given any resources. That's an average university in the UK, let alone a top level university. And this is with, like I said, very minimum resources. Some people don't even get to see their personal future once a week. I don't want to be part of that. That's not education. That's capitalism. And that's a money-making machine. So no, when things change, and I hope some of the things that I'm putting forward, and I know a lot of my colleagues are putting forward in the community changes, then I may consider that I could be in a position where I belong in a university, I belong in an academic institution, and I can change the world that way. But until that changes, I don't see how that is fair to my journey as a person and as an academic. And therefore, it would be hypocritical for me to be preaching all of these things and then going to do that. So there you go.
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Oh boy, kind of everywhere on social media for Travolution Tours. My personal social media is very much limited because I don't like being a slave to technology. I like having my personal space very much. But Travolution Tours is on Facebook, on Instagram. We even have a TikTok and a YouTube channel. So you are very welcome to check us out there. We have a website as well. And every time it's just Travolution Tours. So you don't really need to look farther than that. And on top of that, I have cooperations and collaborations with so many people. All you really need to do is type my name into Google and it will come out with every other thing that I'm doing. So it is a long name to spell. I appreciate that. So, I suggest a copy and paste if that's what you're going to do. But either through Travolution Tours or through just simply Googling me, you will find everything that I'm involved in now and in the future.
It was great to have you on the show, Lillian. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great fun, and I'm super happy to be here.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. What days of the week were named after gods worshipped by the Vikings? Tuesday was named after Tyr, the god of war. Wednesday was named after Odin, or Woden, the raven god. Thursday was named after Thor, the god of strength and thunder. And Friday was named after Frey, the goddess of marriage. We'll end the show with something punny. How did the Vikings send secret messages? Norse code. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.